agreement of some sort. All due courtesy would be afforded him and his counsel to avoid the spectacle that might otherwise be waiting for him there, or that might otherwise be created by his appearance. I just don't know enough about the terms of this appearance today to give you specifics. But needless to say, again, this will be a very, very sobering experience for Cohen.
We were just talking to our reporter who's been camped out outside of that federal courthouse in Alexandria on this, trial involving Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, right? So that's happening in one orbit down in Virginia. And then here in New York, you have what you just described involving Michael Cohen, two former fixtures in Trump's world. And just how extraordinary is it that these two stories are colliding at the very same time?
It is extraordinary, and of course we should all be reminded that neither the Manafort charges nor the Cohen charges are aimed at the president or others in the president's inner circle themselves specifically. It is an incredible confluence of events that we have. What appears, we don't know for sure yet, but I'll go with what I think is the conventional wisdom out there, that it appears that we will have a guilty verdict, at least on most counts, in the Manafort case today. Manafort being, at least for a time, the presidential campaign's senior advisor. And then at the same time, we have the president's longtime closest lawyer and consigliere, if you will, pleading guilty to federal charges in another federal district. It's not good for the president and his team, any way you look at it.
Speaking of the president's team, Greg, let me just play some sound. This is Rudy Giuliani. This is the president's current lawyer talking about Michael Cohen just a couple weeks ago, a moment that really sort of shows how this story, how this relationship between Cohen and Trump started to take a turn. Watch.
I expected something like this from Cohen. He's been lying all week. I mean, he's been lying for years. I mean, the tapes that we have demonstrate any number of very serious lies by him back a year and a half ago, including his fooling people, hiding tape recordings, telling they weren't recorded, lying to their face, breaking faith with them, taping his client, which is a disbarable offense. I don't see how he has any credibility.
Jennifer Rogers, let me actually go to you for this, just as a legal mind listening to him. This was really the moment when open war, broke out between this administration and the guy who once said he'd take a bullet for the president.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Rudy is on behalf of his client trying to distance him from Michael Cohen. And, maybe that's the reason why there's no cooperation agreement here. It's possible that prosecutors have concluded that he's not trustworthy. The problem is this is the president's playbook, right? He has these people close. He trusts them implicitly. Everything's great. They're truth tellers until they're not, right? Until something happens when they have something bad to say about the president, and then, it's all over. So, Giuliani's comments, certainly, I think no one should give any credence at this point. But clearly, the president is going to continue to distance himself from Cohen with this guilty plea today.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you. And John, over to you. Our reporting is that with Cohen, it would be maybe he'd be serving up to 3 years. I guess that's dependent on a judge. And you were essentially saying, whoa, that's way less time than what? Bank fraud, you were saying 10 to 12?
All reports are that he's pleading guilty to a $20 million bank fraud, which under the sentencing guidelines puts him at about 10 or 12 years in jail. So he's looking at the abyss right now. And the only way in the federal system you get out of that situation is by cooperation. That's why it's so significant.
Is that what's implied here? If we were...
Well, the only way that you get a significant reduction is if the government goes to the judge and says, this guy really helped me with another case. Otherwise, he's looking at a long time in jail. That's why I keep going back to the cooperation piece. It doesn't make sense.
Paige Pate, does it make sense to you, or are you befuddled a tad as well?
Befuddle is a good word for it, Brooke. That was the first question I had on my mind when I came to the Bureau and realized that there was a plea deal in the works, because it is so easy for the U.S. Attorney to simply put cooperation language in a plea agreement. It doesn't require the defendant to cooperate, and it certainly doesn't require the government to give the person credit for cooperation. It just leaves the door open. So it's extraordinary that it's not in there unless the government wanted to send a clear message that this plea deal has nothing to do with Michael Cohen being a snitch. And if they wanted to send that message, I think they've done that. But then we come back to the question, how does he get 3 years on a $10 to $20 million bank fraud case? It's extraordinary. I want to see the plea agreement, and I think once we read the language, we'll know a lot more about the details.
Okay, gentlemen, stand by. We should be seeing, according to this schedule I have, should be seeing Michael Cohen walk through those doors in about 10 minutes from now. We'll talk to a former Watergate special prosecutor. We'll talk to Richard Benveniste. We'll get him to weigh in on all things Michael Cohen. Stay with me. Breaking news. Cohen's arrival there at the federal courthouse in New York. Let's go to our Justice correspondent Laura Jarrett, who has some new information on all things Michael Cohen. Laura, what do you have?
Well, Brooke, we're getting a little bit of inside baseball, if you will, and how some of this came about, including how the Southern District of New York worked with the Justice Department to make all of this happen. And as it turns out, the tax division at the Justice Department, which you don't hear from very often, as well as the IRS, actually had to sign off on this deal, even though it's a plea agreement, because it related to tax-related issues. We also have learned that the public integrity section, which typically investigates campaign finance issues, and the criminal section, as well as the Deputy Attorney General's office, were also consulted on the charges. So a lot of cooks in the kitchen on this one. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty, the timing of this plea agreement and why it happened today of all days, I'm told by a source familiar that that is really a negotiation between the prosecutors there in New York and Michael Cohen's defense attorneys. But I'm also told that Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. attorney there in New York, is still recused, and that's why we will see his deputy make the presentation after Cohen's plea agreement there in New York. Brooke?
Right, he's set to speak, we're told, for 5 minutes after we hear from Michael Cohen inside the courthouse. Laura, thank you so much for your inside baseball knowledge. It's important, and thank you. I have with me now former Watergate Special Prosecutor Richard Benveniste, just weighing in on all of this. And Richard, my goodness, I mean, first, just big picture. This is a man who has gone back years and years with this president, who is now going to walk into, we don't know what door, front, side, what have you, but he will be in front of that judge, and he is going to say, yes, I did it. How big of a deal is that?
Oh, of course it's a big deal. This is a man who was very, very close to Donald Trump for any number of years. He was the person to whom Trump turned normally when he got into hot water in one way or another. We know with respect to his sexual adventures that Cohen was the guy he turned to enter into non-disclosure agreements and various other things, and perhaps including things Russian. We may look to Michael Cohen to provide information. And there's no question in my mind but that it behooves him to cooperate once he has decided not to contest the charges against him and to plead guilty.
Yeah, explain that, for people watching and they're thinking, okay, well, what is it exactly he's pleading guilty to? So according to our reporting, it's campaign finance violations, which could be, that direct connection to the Trump campaign, and bank fraud and tax fraud. But to the point about cooperation, what he's doing today doesn't preclude that he couldn't cooperate.
Well, of course it doesn't, Brooke, and you're quite right about that. It's likely that he will cooperate, he will be debriefed, and he will look to the prosecutors then to make a recommendation so that he doesn't do the full extent of time for the various criminal statutes to which he will be pleading guilty.
Richard, stay with me. Paul Callan, I'm turning to you because we were talking earlier and you were saying how some of this just strikes you as bizarre. What's the bizarre part to you?
Well, just the fact that there was no cooperation agreement in place, because for a long time we've gotten signals from the Cohen defense camp that he was looking to make a deal, that he was thinking about his family now, not about the president, and he's got a politically connected lawyer representing him, so everything pointed to a deal being made. And for him now to go in and take a plea without a deal is very, very surprising. Now, in truth, this happens sometimes. As I mentioned earlier, Rick Gates, who was a co-defendant with Paul Manafort, made a deal with the prosecutors after he was indicted. So it's quite possible that Cohen can still strike a deal with prosecutors somewhere down the road. But it's not the usual thing that you see. Usually it's the deal up front, the plea, and then the case moves forward.
And the Southern District has a very rigorous cooperation arrangement. You don't just show up and say, I want to cooperate. They put you through hoops where they question you for a long time, and they expect you to be totally credible and totally honest and give them something that matters. What this signals to me is he doesn't have something to give them, or he hasn't said it in a way that they believe he's credible. So maybe down the line he can cooperate, but if he's not cooperating now, this is a very, very significant turn of events.
Jennifer, do you agree with that?
I do, actually. I think that there has been plenty of time for him to cooperate. There's no question that the debriefings are extensive, but he wouldn't plead guilty if he was going to cooperate, in my view, because a defendant loses leverage when he does that. The prosecutors want the defendant to plead guilty. So as soon as he does, you know, that's kind of where the defendant loses a little bit of the grip there. So to me...
Sure that Robert Mueller knows that he wants a deal.
Yeah.
And here you have a deal that has nothing to do with Cohen agreeing to give dirt on President Trump. And one would think, free of President Trump in particular, but that any fixer who worked for any New York real estate dealer would have plenty of stuff to talk about, and yet it's not part of this deal.
I do think the campaign